Justi meditabitur sapientiam, et lingua eius loquitur judicium. Next Deus in conceptius, noni emulani in maniantibus, nequens in averis facientes iniquitatem. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Meditabitur sapientium, et lingua eius loquitur judicium. Next Deus in conceptium. Justus ut palma florebit, sicut cedrus Libani. Multiplicabitur in domo Domini. Ad annunciandum misericordiam tuum, et veritatem tuum, per Alleluia, alleluia, alleluia. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone wants to be a follower of mine, let him renounce himself and take up his cross and follow me. For anyone who wants to save his life will lose it, but anyone who loses his life for my sake will find it. What then will a man gain if he wins the whole world and ruins his life? Or what has a man to offer in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and when he does, he will reward each one according to his behavior. I tell you solemnly, there are some of these standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming with his kingdom." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. The word for life in the original Greek, which is retranslated into the Hebrew in the translation that we have, theoretically done by experts, is psyche and then nefesh, nafsho in the actual Hebrew. The word then would be more than just life. It would be the very essence of the being. One does ruin one's life by ruining the essence of one's being. But the notion of soul is actually far more profound than that just of life. For this reason, that the soul goes on even when life as we know it does not any longer exist. Being with people who are about to die, one sees that very clearly. Their character does not change sometimes, even in pain, and that character, that soul, does not depend on the crumbling body. And the Lord says here that there will be a reward according to his behavior. He will reward each one according to his behavior. Again, the Semitic way would not be an abstract concept like behavior, but it would say deeds, according to his deeds. What are the sum of our deeds but our behavior? But our behavior is made up of very concrete deeds. The tendency of a person to be unpleasant, for instance, is that person's behavior. And whereas in the context of a good person who is not inclined to upset, one interprets an individual and isolated word in that global context of one who does not mean to offend by that word, which could be misinterpreted. So also in reverse, a person who is interested in causing pain habitually, one interprets one more word again, which in someone else's mouth or pen would be acceptable, as not acceptable, but meant to hurt. And people are in mode of hurting or healing as they go through life. The two tendencies tend to make, in a sense, a great demarcation in humanity. That is, of course, both and in all of us. But there is that tendency, one can say, to go through life healing or to go through life hurting. And who is hurt but the person who causes hurt? And hence it increases the need to hurt again, so as to avoid the pain. It actually happens even in consecrated souls. There is ecclesiastical bullying around, perhaps less today than yesterday because the Council reacted strongly against it, as have many documents coming since. But it is there. One can misuse authority. On the contrary, a person who gets through to another soul and gets the confidence of that soul, as St. Benedict says, a winner of souls has far more authority in the long run. Now, St. Dominic, that we are feasting today, was much loved by his brethren, but he was also, and in the first instance, a person who was absorbed in the divine. We are told by those who knew him that he would rarely speak unless it be of God or to God. That is a program of life. We also know that the night hours were given to prayer, and that seems to be a constant in the life of the consecrated, at least those who tend to want to consecrate all their affective bonding to the Lord, that they cannot get away from the mystical union of the night. The night invites to intimacy, and even in active souls, such as Mother Teresa, we know that the night was given to the Lord. The night. And the Lord himself gives that model insofar as he also limited severely his sleep by giving nights to the Father on the mountain. And in solitary places he would go there on his own as early as he could. We have quite a few hints of that in the Gospel. The model then for us all, the night and the early morn. And then it is that one acts out of that. The rocket is correctly fired, whereas plunging ourselves into work straight away without that sacred gap, that emptiness, that capacity to be filled and touched, is quite different. We plunge ourselves into noise and we become noise. We emit much energy, but often in vain. We fire many shots, but they all land awry. Whereas coming quietly from encounter, the Lord is able then to direct our words, and they can be fewer, but they can aim and hit hard, which brings me to where I want to land. St. Dominic hit hard. The question of preaching is of eternal value, and I mean eternal because the word has consequences in eternity. If one looks back over one's life, one can pick out certain sermons, and it's a pity that word has disappeared from circulation. It's more powerful than the word homily. And one can see that certain sermons do have and will have and have had over life and therefore eternity a certain impact. When growing up, I was in a Benedictine parish, and the 6 monks there were men of great culture because they were formed in the classical English Benedictine atmosphere, and we know what that means. But one or two of them were actually pretty good on this specific question of preaching, despite the sometimes academic background that they might have. One in particular was so good that by instinct, if I were going to the 8 o'clock Mass on a Saturday morning, I would tend to wait until the beginning of the conventual Mass, which was somewhat later. They would chant Lauds with their hoods up in the Benedictine fashion, and then they would all stay for the conventual Mass at 9:15. And there would be a homily. And it was worth just staying for that homily before going home. And I still remember now some of the homilies that one of the brethren in particular, Dom Kevin, who later became prior there, would give. He would start off something like this. I was walking along the street and there was a hole in the ground, and off he would go with a sermon on the hole in the ground. Or again, I was watching an advert last night and it was all about the Colgate Ring of Confidence, and off he would go about the Colgate Ring of Confidence. Or again, the other day I was going down to the docks and I noticed one of these gas cylinders, these gigantic things which hold all the gas of Cardiff, and I noticed how, according to the pressure they're in, they would go up and down, up and down. And I thought to myself, oh, how wonderful it would be to be ensconced on the top of one of these gas cylinders and to go up and down, up and down. Because when one is up, one sees the whole of Cardiff, and when one is down, one sees the detail. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to go up and down and to see things in the global context and to have the long view of things. And off he would go about the long view of things. Sermons which until death one will not forget. It's rather like in the computer, one puts an attachment. In this way too, one can attach a truth to a visual concept. And remembering the visual concept, the truth too goes in and stays in. They say that one never forgets anything. It's just one sometimes cannot always recall it. And so it is that sometimes something else triggers off something which is there hidden in the recesses of the memory. So sermons sometimes are there, dormant, and come up years later. Oh, I remember that sermon. But there are sermons also which are life-changing. I remember when, at the age of 17, I happened to go into the church of Sainte Jeanne d'Arc in Rouen, and it was already in 1971, that was the year spending the holidays there learning French, that it was already there. They had the anticipation of the Sunday Mass, and therefore it was a full Sunday Mass, even at 6:30 in the evening of a Saturday. The church was full, and the sermon was, as they were in France, at least in those days, well prepared, and lasted a good quarter of an hour, 20 minutes. And he just started off, come with me, follow me down the N2 and go down to L'Aigle and go down to the monastery down the end there. He'd just been on retreat to La Trappe. So for that sermon he just described the life at La Trappe. And at the age of 17 that was something which stayed and eventually had an effect, a life-changing effect. How many sermons actually do have that on our Sunday average in Ireland? It's rather a pity that that potential is not exploited, sometimes out of fear of not upsetting people or in any way messing up the peace which is there, upsetting the apple cart, as we say, and thereby reducing the connection. One has to be politically correct, and therefore nothing life-changing is said. But there are also ways and means of getting through to the imagination by the fact that it matters a lot whether a sermon is word for word read, and therefore not in the same way communicated, or whether it is actually said in a living and vibrant way, eyeball to eyeball, because one sees straight away when one is not being listened to, and that's the problem. If one is reading, one does not pick that up. I remember hearing in college, where I was doing theology for a while at Bangor with future preachers, but they were already preaching over the weekend, these nonconformists, and one lassie mentioned with regard to another one of our friends there that he did not have the sensitivity to know when people wanted him to stop. He carried on. And knowing where to stop is as important as knowing how to start, because one stops when one reaches a crescendo and leaves the force of the crescendo in the air to explode in the ears and imaginations, and therefore the memories of the hearers. In Italy, as they say, one has to learn the principle, if you can't beat them, join them. At this time of year, August, if one were to send, for instance, to celebrate the feast of the Assumption in church, one will find a packed church, but it will be pretty hot there, so the women are looking at you in this mode. So one has to find some means of waking them up. And of course, the way to do that is to do as they do, bring the whole body into activity. Raise the voice, but especially if one is not habitually raising the voice, because then they wake up. It should be up and down, rather like the cylinder, and not always on a monotone. In other words, variation, variety is the spice of life, and that is true also for a sermon. A bit of everything. I remember one time preaching in Welsh, and it was a Catholic Mass at Pwllheli, but my mother happened to be there, and she is a good nonconformist, a Baptist, and of course she would be into what we call sermon tasting. Therefore you'd be compared, and quite often severely, with other preachers of the area. But she did make a post-mortem the following morning over breakfast, and she came out with one or two things and ticked a few boxes and so on. Yes, there was the contrast, yes, going up and down, noise and quiet. But whatever you do, don't do that to the nuns today, because it was the time to go to the Carmelites. In other words, one has to adapt to one's congregation. But it is important to be aware that one can actually make of the sermon not just a part of the liturgy, but a part of life. Because in days of old, when there was not much going on in the way of entertainment, e.g. before television came in, people, at least in Wales, would make of the weekly sermon something of that, and it would be discussed for the rest of the week. And I understand that it's still the case in the Bible Belt there in Alabama. They tend to talk for a long time on the event of the Sunday sermon. And why should it be less with us? It is an event. That slot of making the word live is important. People need a certain uplift and upbeat, and it is a time in which that can happen. For after all, if one goes with the same quantity of knowledge out of church as one had coming in, one is on an even keel, never going up, never increasing the volume. One needs to be changed by a sermon and to go out of church enriched and switched on. There has to be an input of voltage. Something has to happen. So the sermon is something to be expounded and expanded. I just conclude. It doesn't have to be long. I remember the abbot in France at La Trappe saying that one day, because liturgy was already long. Ça n'a pas besoin d'être très long. But he didn't mean by that it didn't have to have an effect. I have noticed that quite often sermons, by their brevity and force and pithiness, often have the greatest effect. Why? Because a word left in suspense and not covered by other words remains free to act. So sometimes a few words, very carefully aimed, can be like a well-prepared atom bomb. Fidelis servus et prudens, quam constituit Dominus, super familiam suam, udet iunis in tempore Laudate omnes gentes, laudate Dominum, 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 laudate omnes gentes, laudate te Dominum.